HQ mode. Material transparency has two modes in Blender, dithered and blended. In the add-on and documentation, we refer to dithered and blended as HQ and LQ. On the HQ LQ menu, we can see a number of warnings. First, no active camera in scene. For HQ mode to be used, you need to have an active camera in your scene. So I'll add a camera. I'm going to lock my camera to the view using the little padlock icon. And I'm going to enable use active camera for my object. That way I can navigate around my viewport, looking for the camera with the object automatically updating its faces. Now, the warning about the camera has gone. I can see a warning about samples. LQ mode, which we're currently in, requires high samples, and HQ mode sometimes needs only one sample. We'll keep that in mind for later. Below this, I can see listed all the materials for my selected object. If I add more materials to this object, I can see now that they're now both listed, and I can set LQHQ for either of them. I'm going to stick with using just the standard KIRI 3D render material, and I'm going to see what happens when I toggle this to HQ mode. Immediately, the object started to look a lot cleaner and a lot smoother. If I look at the modifiers stack, I can see that we have a modifier called 3DGS Sorter. When I flip to HQ mode, this modifier gets turned on. When I go to LQ mode, it gets turned off. The material, I can see dithered for LQ mode and blended for HQ mode. While working, it can sometimes be advised to use LQ mode, especially when doing color edits or vertex painting, but for final renders, you should always use HQ mode. If you're working on a full-scale scene scan, LQ mode can be advised, but a single object like this, HQ mode is usually fine for the 3D viewport. Now about the samples. I can see that shadeless is enabled for this object. And in Eevee, I have shadows enabled. This will make no difference since shadeless is enabled and this object isn't reacting to light. So I'm going to disable shadows, and in the HQLQ menu, set the viewport and render samples to 1. And I can see there's no drop in performance. If I try to render now, it renders in 0.23 seconds. If I was using the default samples of 64 for the render, it would take almost 2 seconds. And on a larger scene, it would take much longer. This is very important to note. Whenever you're rendering, try dropping your samples to 1 and make sure HQ mode is enabled. If this object was reacting to light, and I disabled shadeless and added some lighting, now if I render, it still looks good at 1 sample. If I enable shadows, I can see that it's getting quite grainy. You can try to keep upping the samples until you get something more acceptable. Maybe 35 is okay. And I can see that the time has increased since we're rendering shadows. Don't forget you can also use a denoiser in the compositor if you want to use low samples to try and clean up some of those shadows. The denoiser does quite a nice job of smoothing things out, but it's still best to do some tests before any animation renders. Below the HQ-LQ toggle, we can see a toggle for objects overlap. If you have multiple 3D.js objects in your scene, and both are set to use HQ mode, you may find that one sitting on top of the other makes the other completely disappear. This is when we have to use objects overlap. If I switch on objects overlap and generate HQ object, we'll see that my two current objects will be moved into a new collection. There's a warning telling you about this. My original objects have been placed into 3D.js LQ objects, and a new object, which is a combined version of the two, is sitting in 3D.js HQ object. If I look at my render view now, I can see that both objects are combined nicely. If I decide that I want to continue editing the position, scale, or any other attributes of these objects, switching back to LQ mode will switch the visibility of the merged HQ object and the LQ objects. I can perform my edits while in LQ mode, and then when I'm ready, switch back to HQ, and we'll see the merged object. If I decide at any point that I don't want to use objects overlap, I can turn this setting off. If an HQ object exists in the scene, I'll get a prompt that I can delete it if I want. And now I'm left with just my original LQ objects. If you have multiple HQ objects in your scene and they are behind or in front of each other, but they don't intersect, that's fine, and you don't need to enable objects overlap.